Okay, so we left off last week on the top of page 110. First full paragraph is where we left off at. Now, this is the chapter entitled Two Wives. And these are some of what I have heard in the past described as like the forgotten chapters. Like, why are we reading something about two our wives? We know our wives. We know all enough about them. Why are we reading this, right? Find, honestly, even as we continue on, if you were here last week, um, there are so many clear-cut directions for those of us who are working with new people, then possibly there isn't a chapter prior to it called Working with Others. A lot of people think that's the only chapter. Chapter 7 is the one that you want to learn how to sponsor or mentor somebody. It's a chapter 7, Working with Others. It's actually chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 5 of the 11 chapters. Almost half of this book of directions is only about step 12 in how to work with other people. Once you study this properly, there should be no questions as to what to do or what not to do when you're working with somebody. They cover about every single circumstance. But again, this meeting, it was mentioned, is open to anyone and everyone interested in a spiritual way of life. And we know by looking at on page 159, bottom of 159 and top of 160, that in the early days, our AA meetings were attended by anyone or everyone interested in the spiritual way of life, including the family members. And we've also learned by now that we work with the family members when we're working with other people. Didn't we find that on the in Working with Others? It starts on page 89. And the first direction it gives us is on the top of page 90. And it says the first thing you do when you're working with somebody. So you want to find out if they really want to quit. It's the first thing you need to know, whether you're wasting your time or not, is really what it amounts to, right? Does it? Yeah. What did it say in order to move forward with this program? It talks about around step 3. If you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, not paying lip service, but you're willing to go, you're hurting bad enough that you're willing to do anything, then you're ready to take certain steps. Conversely, if you are not willing to go to any lengths or you don't want what we have, then you are not ready to take any further steps. You're either going to have to get more convinced. And the only way that I've seen in this book to get more convinced is what? Go back out and drink, try to control your drinking, try to find another approach. And it's either you will find another approach that works for you, or you may get beaten to a state of reasonableness, or you may die. Those are the options. So anyhow, what we find here is after we find out whether somebody wants to drink, the very second direction it gives us when we're working with a new person is to have a talk with the person closest to them, which is generally a spouse, a parent, or a loved one. Because we found that this chapter is not just two wives. It says on the very first page of this chapter is for anyone that's tied by blood or affection to the alcoholic, right? So we start having a talk with them. What do we talk with them about? Well, in that chapter, it talks about it comes up with 4 or 5 different questions of what we want to find out from the loved one about the alcoholic. But it goes on much more, and we're starting to see this keyed in here. And I want to just go back just a little bit. If we go back to page 107, I don't want to go back too far, but 107, the first full paragraph, they spend the first few pages in this chapter talking about what we as alcoholics have put our loved ones through, the hell that they've been put through, and the crazy confusion that we put them through. Forget about what we may have done, abusively, physically, mentally, spiritually, all that, but just the confusion they're put through. Such as, I think the biggest thing, and I've mentioned this before, is when you're given an ultimatum as an alcoholic. This happens so often, especially by a loved one. You drink again, you're out. You're out of here. Taking the kids, we're done. We've heard that. You heard that often enough? Heard that often enough in Al-Anon as well. Right. And here's the confusing thing. You think this person loves you. You may have been with them for a long time, but then they go out and drink again. So common sense would tell you what? They don't love me, or they find drinking more important, right? Why else would they do it? Well, what we found in the beginning of this book is it has to do with this mental insanity that we have. We don't reflect on the consequences. In fact, that other person and their ultimatum doesn't even come into our mind because we are so damn miserable being sober that we need something to feel better so bad that we don't reflect on the consequences of what's going to happen to me from drinking. What we're going to be reflecting on is how it's going to make me feel because I need to feel better. So we don't reflect on it. Do you think it's important for them to know that and not walk away thinking that, they just doesn't love me? So that's it. Obviously, it's common sense. So there's a lot of, as it was mentioned in the beginning, a lot of misunderstanding about alcoholism. So it says on page 107, first full paragraph, they're talking about these things, right at the top, these things terrified and distracted us. The next paragraph starts out, under these conditions, we naturally made mistakes, and some of them rose out of ignorance of alcoholism, which I just stated, ignorance of alcoholism. Need to understand alcoholism. Maybe it says sometimes we sense dimly that we were dealing with sick men, but had we fully understood the nature of the alcoholic illness, we might have behaved differently. Well, where do we find the nature of the alcoholic? Where do we find that at? The nature of the alcoholic illness. I mean, we found even on page XVI in the very beginning, we said, Bill, what's the first thing he had to learn? He learned from Dr. Silkworth, the grave nature of alcoholism. He learned what that means, what's wrong with their mind and what's wrong with their body. And they said they may have made some different choices had they better understood that. Okay. And if you go to page 18, the top of page 18, this is going way back in the book, chapter 2, says an illness of this sort, and we've come to believe it an illness, by the way. And if you don't have this written down, an illness is defined as a condition that prevents the normal functioning of the mind and or body. That is the definition of an illness. It says it involves those about us in a way no other human sickness can. If a person has cancer, all are sorry for him, and no one's angry or hurt. But not so with the alcoholic illness, for with it there goes annihilation of all things worthwhile in life, and it engulfs all whose lives touch the sufferers. It brings misunderstanding, fierce resentment, financial insecurity, disgusted friends and employers, warped lives of blameless children, sad wives and parents, and anyone can increase that list. But the next sentence I would underline. We hope that this volume will inform and comfort those who are or who may be affected. There are many. Sounds like that's another purpose of this book. It's not just for the alcoholic. They hope this volume will inform and comfort those who have been affected. So how are they going to get associated with this book? How are they going to know that? I mean, the title of the book says Alcoholics Anonymous. We've got one person here said they're an Al-Anon. That's not Alcoholics Anonymous. I wouldn't think that this is for me. So how are they going to be informed by that? Well, let's move on. If you go to top of page 108, it's saying the same thing. First paragraph, they go into all these questions about the alcoholic. Where's their willpower? Why are they so blind about, even if they don't love us, how are they so blind about how they hurt themselves? Don't they see that one drink means ruin? Don't they see this? And it says, these are some of the questions which race through the mind of every woman who has an alcoholic husband. Back to, we hope this book has answered some of those questions. So it says, we hope that this book has answered. So that means those answers are probably prior to this chapter, right? That's where they would have been answered. But again, sounds like they're going to need to learn something out of this book. We get in the picture here. Didn't we read also in chapter 7? I'm not going to go into it. Just how we continue to offer our way of living to the family, even if we start working with a new person, and then we get introduced to the family and we have our discussion with them, and the new person ends up going out and drinking again. It says we continue to be friendly and offer our way of living to the family members as well. Anybody ever heard that in AA before? I've never heard that in AA, and I've been doing this since I was 14. I'd never heard that until I started studying this book, which has only been about 14 years now of all that time. I'd never heard this before, but they're telling us this over and over. So then we get into some of these clear-cut directions. Try not to condemn your alcoholic husband no matter what he says or does. That's one of the first directions that we got. And that is probably one of the hardest conversations you're ever going to have with a loved one. Yeah, right? Don't condemn him no matter what he says or what he does. Like, I'm ready to club him over the head, but why? Why? Didn't we just read something in the beginning that's in the next chapter, at the end of the next chapter? We're talking before this meeting about smoking and quitting smoking and stuff like that. And there's a story in here about somebody who was recovered, and But he drank a lot of coffee. This is a preview of coming attractions, I guess. So I'm just going to summarize it. He drank a lot of coffee and he smoked a lot. And his wife didn't like it, said that she thought there was something sinful about these kind of commodities. So she nagged him. And as a result of all this nagging, he got drunk. Not her fault. The next sentence says he was wrong. And it goes on to say he was dead wrong, right? So he ended up having to make amends and he ended up having to start this process all over again. Luckily, he didn't die and he was able to do that. But then it goes on to say he's one of the most useful members in Alcoholics Anonymous now at that time. And as such, he still smokes and drinks and nobody admonishes him about it. Right? Right? So what's the key there? What's the problem there? The problem is if you go to page 117, this is jumping ahead just a little bit. And down at the bottom of the page, you jump up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. 5 lines from the bottom of the page on 117 from the bottom. It says, never forget that resentment is a deadly hazard to any alcoholic. That's why. It is a deadly hazard. We also found on page 64, they tell us, I believe, the exact same thing. Right? We talked about this, I think maybe even last week. It says resentment's the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics more than anything else. From it stem all sorts of spiritual disease. By the way, it's the only place that you're going to see the word disease in this book when they talk about spiritual disease. And then we also read somewhere that it talks about how, and it's one of the first directions I always give somebody I work with, we talked about last week, I believe as well, that we need to avoid resentment like the plague, because that's going to kill you more than anything. It's not the Jack Daniels, it's not the wine. That's not what's going to kill you. It's the resentment. And that's what the family member needs to know as well. Okay, it doesn't excuse us. And none of this stuff is an excuse. It's simply an explanation. And I tell you, these are hard conversations, and you need to be fully prepared and understand this book pretty well to have these with a family member. But I tell you, you may get a lot of pushback on this, kind of like you're making an excuse for them, right? Then you just simply ask, well, then tell me what makes sense to you. Why does he go back out and do it? You don't know. They don't know. And you know what? You ask the alcoholic, we've read in here. He doesn't know either why he went back out. This makes pretty good sense. That's why. Number one offender. We have to remember that. Family members need to know. How are they going to know that? Sounds like somebody's going to have to teach it to them, right? So that's what we do. And I've mentioned before, we have on our website under the documents page, and there's step study documents under step 12, there's a family orientation page that takes you through every different line in this book to give them a good understanding of what alcoholism is, what it's about, and what part you can play in helping the recovery of your loved one. It's all in there. So anyhow, so then we get to page, where are we at here? So then we got into talking about what? The 4 husbands, the 4 types of husbands is where we left off. And before we get to that, there's one last thing I wanted to hit on. And it goes back, here it is again. Try not to condemn your alcoholic on page 108. When he angers you, remember he is very ill. He is sick. Okay? But then it goes on in that next paragraph, says, if you're positive he is one of these type, then you'd better leave. That's one of these type that are just, what does it say? That they're thoroughly bad intentioned. Okay? If that's the case, you may have to leave. Is it right to let him ruin your life and the lives of your children? And here's the question here. This is very interesting. It says, and I would underline this, especially when he has before him a way to stop his drinking and abuse if he really wants to pay the price. When we come here as alcoholics, we don't have a way out. We've tried every solution to get out and we haven't found one. Generally, that's the case, right? Doesn't excuse the behavior of us whatsoever. But wait, we have no way out. We want out just as much as our loved ones want us to find a way out. But when you start working with a person and you start explaining what an alcoholic is and you start explaining our solution, well, guess what? Whether they decide to take it or not, they now have been informed that there is a way out if they're willing to pay the price, if they're willing to go to any lengths. If they choose not to, they have a choice now, I guess is what I'm getting at. They have a choice to get well because they have a solution in front of them. If they don't want to take it, then take note of that if you're a loved one, that they don't want to take it. There's no excuse for it at this point, right? That's what they're pointing out. So we get into the 4 different categories of husbands. The husband number 1, a couple of the main points, it says that that his drinking may be constant or he may be heavy only on certain occasions. So this could be, this is interesting. And these are different classifications they're putting for 4 different, as it gets worse and worse and worse, right? The progression. So in alcoholic number one could be a constant drinker. I don't even want to say alcoholic, a drinker, a husband number 1. It doesn't say an alcoholic. Husband number 1. What that means is he may or may not be an alcoholic. But what are the earmarks that we got here? Is that he could be drinking every day, but that is not what makes him an alcoholic. It says a couple of things. One is that he does not see what it's doing to him. It says he does not see it. And 2, this is the most important thing. This is back to, do you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to it? This is the deal. This guy is positive he can still handle his liquor. He can control it. He can either moderate or quit if he really wants to. And says he would probably be insulted if he were called an alcoholic. The world is full of people like this. Okay. The next thing it says, some will moderate or stop altogether, and some will not. So there's your alcoholic and non-alcoholic, as we read on page 44. If you can stop or moderate altogether, you're not an alcoholic. Even if you drink every day, even if you can stop, given a good reason, you can stop or moderate, you're not an alcoholic. If you're not sure if you're one of those, try to control, moderate, or stop altogether. Most of us have already tried and found we couldn't when we got here. But that's the only thing that makes you an alcoholic or not. It doesn't matter how much you drink or how often you drink or any of that. It's, can you stop? But whether this guy can stop or can't stop, whether this person is an alcoholic or not, one thing they want to point out as being an alcoholic number 1 is that he still thinks he can handle his liquor. There's not a lot of hope for that in Alcoholics Anonymous, because he's not going to be willing to go to any lengths because he doesn't even think he's got a problem, for sure. So that's what we're looking for with a new person when we're working with them. So they think they can still handle this or control it. Maybe I just need to come here and just get it together for a little while, and then I'll be able to handle my life again. You know, what did we read in the beginning? We're not signing up to get sober. We didn't read the word sober anywhere in the beginning here. Sober is defined as not drunk. What we found in the beginning of this book is that we have a way of living. So for an alcoholic, as long as you want to continue living, we continue this way of life. This is a way of life. This is not a we do 1 through 12 and we graduate, right? That's not how this works. So it goes on to husband number 2. Husband number 2 has got a little bit more of a problem. He's got showing a little lack of control. He's unable to stay on the water wagon even when he wants to. Now, didn't we read that in the 2 questions on page 44 to determine if you're an alcoholic? If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, you're probably an alcoholic. This is a guy who, even when he honestly wants to, he can't stay on the water wagon. So husband number 2 must have tried quitting and found he can't. So he may certainly be one of us if he can't. But the question is does he realize it? Because this willingness to go to any lengths, you have to be convinced. And what does it say? He admits that he often gets entirely out of hand when drinking. He admits this is true, but here's the problem. He's positive that he will do better. Positive he can do better. It's good to look at page 24 with that. Take a little look back. And if you look at the first full paragraph, we cover this a lot because we know we got the problem with the mind, the problem with the body. And it says the crux of the problem is the mind. If we don't pick up the first one, we don't have to worry about allergic reaction that we end up drinking more than we intend to because of an allergic reaction, which is manifested by a craving beyond our mental control. That'll never happen if we don't pick up the first one. So if we get good reason, we get in a lot of trouble, we decide, you know what, I'm done and I quit. Stopping and not picking up the first one. That's the crux of the problem, is not picking up that first one. So why do we pick up that first one? They were just asking that question over and over and over. This first paragraph on 24, I believe, is one of the most important statements in this book because it tells us specifically what is wrong with the alcoholic according to Alcoholics Anonymous. What is wrong with our mind? When they talk about being restored to sanity in step 2, this is the insanity. Insanity does not mean crazy. It does not mean insane. I always thought it did. I found using a dictionary, I found it very enlightening at how wrong I've been about the meaning of a lot of words. Even recovered, I thought that meant cured. That's not what it means. That's not what these things mean. Insanity, sanity is defined as soundness or wholeness of mind. So somebody who is insane is somebody who does not have a sound or whole mind. Might have 99.95% of a whole mind, but something to do with this alcohol thing, we're off. Right? When we weigh risk versus reward, does it make sense when we pick it back up again? There is no making sense out of it. It's not, well, it was worth it. Anybody ever do that? Anybody ever go back out and realize, say, well, you know what? It was really worth it. I really had, I got in a lot of trouble. I lost my wife and kids, but damn it, I had a good time. It was worth it. Absolutely not. So why do we do it? Well, it says right here, and it's all and again, in italics. Very important. It says the fact is for most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, we've lost the power of choice and drink. As alcoholics, I don't care if you're recovered or not, we do not have a choice. You'll hear people, I have a choice whether I drink today. You do not understand Alcoholics Anonymous. We do not have a choice whether we drink today or not. That is left to God. We do not have a choice. If I had a choice, I would not be here because I have a choice. I wouldn't want to. That would be sane thinking. We do not have a choice because our so-called willpower, and that's what we use if we have a choice, right? Our willpower. I'm going to stop drinking, and our willpower is always backed by a consequence. The reason I'm not going to do this, or the reason I'm going to do this, is because of what happened. I don't want that to happen, so I'm not going to drink. That's the way the mind works, right? It says our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent because we are unable at certain times, and I would really focus at certain times. Some of us can hold ourselves in check and stay sober for long, long periods of time, not being recovered. Miserable as all get out, but can stay sober. So this doesn't happen with us all the time. At certain times, we're unable to bring into the consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. And that's what leaves us without defense against the first drink. In other words, we have a memory problem. We don't reflect on the consequences sometimes because we need to feel better. We don't think about the consequences. That is a mental illness. And it happens with every one of us if you're an alcoholic. Okay. And again, I've mentioned this before. So you take that into what you may have learned in some conventional AA meetings, where they say, your sponsor, call me every day. Is that not saying that you're depending on your sponsor? Is your sponsor going to bring into the consciousness with sufficient force on that one time that you're not reflecting on the consequence? Are they going to be there right then? Or do you think you're going to call them then? You don't see anything wrong with picking it up. You need to feel better. You're not going to call your sponsor. It tells us we're beyond human aid. Your mentor, these meetings, this is my higher power. I've heard that a million times. It's full of people. We are beyond human aid. This is what goes on with our mind, this insanity. So we're without defense. That's why we end up doing it. But then, and it goes on to make, and I love the way that they put this out. They say the almost certain consequences that following taking even a glass of beer do not crowd into the mind to deter us. And if these thoughts do occur, they're hazy and readily supplanted by the old threadbare idea that this time we shall handle ourselves like other people. See husband number one and husband number two. We can control it. Okay. There is a complete failure of the kind of defense that keeps one from putting his hand on the hot stove. The alcoholic may say to himself in the most casual way, it won't burn me this time, so here's how. Right? That's crazy, isn't it? Do we not know it's going to burn us again? And yet we get burned much worse than putting our hand on a hot stove, and yet we go back to it. Insane. That's the insanity. The thing is, we have to get, I don't say we have to get, the alcoholic has to understand that he is beyond human aid. He has to try every imaginable remedy, be it a human solution, be it treatment centers is a big one nowadays. Go into AA meetings, go to 90 meetings in 90 days, stick with the winners and all this BS that's not in this book. It's not in this book. And we learned that the AA recovery program is where? In the first portion of this book is what they told us. It's not in the first portion of the book. It's not Alcoholics Anonymous, according to the authors of Alcoholics Anonymous, not according to me. So we need to follow what's in this book. So we go on to, so that's alcoholic number two. It says, he's begun to try with or without your cooperation various means of moderating or staying dry. Dry being sober. So this guy's trying to stay dry. He's worried at times, and he's becoming aware that he cannot drink like other people. Now, there's somebody we're starting to get a little bit of hope for. He's starting to become aware that he can't control or moderate this. He's getting there. He's remorseful after serious drinking bouts and tells you he wants to stop. That's somebody that's important. I want to stop now. But when he gets over a spree, how many of you have gone through this? But when he gets through the spree, we come through, we're remorseful, we feel like hell. But after he gets over the spree, then he begins to think once more how he can drink moderately again. I can control it this time. Could be a week, could be a month, could be 6 months, could be a year. How many people do we see in the first year go in and out and in and out? And yet they tell us that it's very rare for someone to fail. Yet we see it all the time. We think this person's in danger because those are the earmarks of the real alcoholic. So now we get on to husband number 3 that we covered last week. He admits he cannot drink like other people, but he doesn't see why. It says in about 6, 7 lines down on page 110. He admits. Well, that's what we find in step 1. We're admitting. I cannot drink like other people, but he doesn't know why. That's a really good place for somebody to be if they honestly know that they can't quit. And if you ask them honestly, they don't know why. They shouldn't know why. When you see the explanation in this book, I never guessed that. I never guessed that insanity thing happened. I never guessed that I can't moderate because of an allergic reaction. I never guessed that. So he doesn't know why. That's a good place to be. He clings to the notion he's going to find another way. I mean, we have to. We have to keep trying and keep trying. How many of you have gone through that race over and over, trying to find another way, trying to find another way? He may have come to the point where he desperately wants to stop but cannot. That's the key. Desperately wants to stop, knows he can't. And that's why it says in the last sentence, you can be quite hopeful of a situation like this. Right? Now, he may be as alcoholic as husband number 1 or 2, but the hopefulness is because he wants to stop and knows he can't. That's why step 1 is all about the doctor's opinion. The first 3 chapters of this book, it is to get very well informed of what an alcoholic is so you can make a determination whether you're an alcoholic or not. That's why those chapters are so incredibly important. So husband number 4, you may have a husband of whom you've complete despair. He's been placed in one institution after another. He is violent or appears definitely insane when drunk. Sometimes he drinks on the way home from the hospital. Perhaps he's had DTs. Doctors may shake their heads and advise you to have him committed. Maybe you've already been obliged to put him away. This picture may not be as dark as it looks for many of our husbands were just as far gone, yet they got well. Okay, so that's number 4. You might have some recognition of number 4 in the back. So let's now go back to husband number 1. We're going to look at this a little closer now. Oddly enough, he's often difficult to deal with. He enjoys drinking. See, he still enjoys it. The consequences are not outweighing the enjoyment he's getting. It stirs his imagination. His friends feel closer over a highball. Perhaps you enjoy drinking with him yourself when he doesn't go too far. You've passed happy evenings together, chatting and drinking before your fire. Perhaps you both like parties which would be dull without liquor. We've enjoyed such evenings ourselves, and we had a good time. We know about liquor as a social lubricant. Some, but not all of us, think it has its advantages when reasonably used. The first principle of success we go back to again is that you should never be angry. There's that question again, that statement. The first principle of success for a loved one is to never be angry. Even though your husband becomes unbearable and you have to leave him temporarily, you should, if you can, go without rancor. Patience and good temper are most necessary. Our next thought, clear-cut directions, is that you should never tell him what he must do about his drinking. Now, you know they're doing that, right? How many of you had your closest loved ones tell you what you need to do about your drinking? And how many did that work for? I think we read earlier, frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices, right? If he gets the idea that you are a nag or a killjoy, your chance of accomplishing anything useful may be 0. He will use that as an excuse to drink more. He will tell you he is misunderstood. This may lead to lonely evenings for you. He may seek someone else to console him, not always another man. but I guess maybe sometimes. Be determined that your husband's drinking is not going to spoil your relationship with your children and your friends. They need your companionship and your help. Underline this. It is possible to have a full and useful life, though your husband continues to drink. They would have never thought. They would have never thought. We know women who are unafraid, even happy under these conditions. We've got testimony here of people who have done this. Is not theory. This is based on experience. Do not set your heart on reforming your husband. There's direction number 3. Do not set your heart on reforming him. You may be unable to do so no matter how hard you try. So we know these suggestions are sometimes difficult to follow, do you think? But you will save many a heartbreak if you can succeed in observing them. Your husband may come to appreciate your reasonableness and patience. This may lay the groundwork for a friendly talk about his alcoholic problem. Try to have him bring up the subject himself and be sure you are not critical during such a discussion. Attempt instead to put yourself in his place. Underline, let him see that you want to be helpful rather than critical. Very hard things. I couldn't imagine doing that, being on the other side of this. But I guess it's the same with the alcoholic. If you've tried everything to find happiness in your home and bringing your home together with this alcoholic person, you have been unsuccessful to do so. You may be open-minded to try some things that are really tough to do. And they're based, again, on experience. The testimony says this is what has worked. And this is the testimony of more than the loved ones of more than 100 men and women. That's who authored the book. Not one person, more than 100 men and women. These are their spouses. When a discussion does arise, you might suggest that he read this book, or at least the chapter on alcoholism. Sounds like they're going to need to be pretty well understanding of this book and the chapter on alcoholism themselves, huh? If they're going to suggest them to suggest their loved one to read it. Tell him you've been worried, though perhaps needlessly. You think he ought to know the subject better, and everyone should have a clear understanding of the risks he takes if he drinks too much. Show him you have confidence in his power to stop or moderate. Say you do not want to be a wet blanket, that you only want him to take care of his health, thus you may succeed in interesting him in alcoholism. He probably has several alcoholics among his own acquaintances. Most of us do, don't we? Most of us usually do. You might suggest that you both take an interest in them. At underline, drinkers like to help other drinkers. We sure do. Your husband may be willing to talk to one of them. So if this kind of approach does not catch your husband's attention, it may be best to drop the subject. And it's going to be a hard thing to get them to be willing to do. They want this person to get better. And now you're saying drop the subject because there's nothing more that you can do. He has to be beat, or she has to be beaten to a state of reasonableness. Which is interesting. I noticed today, this is the first meeting we've had. We've got more females here than we have males. And I remember it wasn't too long ago. There was only one female. Is this only a men's meeting? Well, it's not now, is it? Right? It may be the best to drop the subject, but after a friendly talk, your husband will usually revive the topic himself. And this may take patient waiting, but it will be worthwhile. Underline this. Meanwhile, you might try to help the wife of another serious drinker. How about that? Once you've been informed and have found a solution, you might want to do the same thing we're doing, is offer this solution to somebody else. If you act upon these principles that are principles here laid out, your husband may stop or moderate. Suppose, however, that your husband fits the description of number 2. The same principles which apply to husband number 1 should be practiced. But after his next binge, ask him if he would really like to get over drinking for good. Do not ask that he do it for you or anyone else, just what he like to. Are these clear-cut directions? Right? After he gets through a spree or a binge, they mean the same thing. Does anybody remember what a spree is? Paul? Paul has been here for a while. See if you still remember.
An unrestrained overindulgence.
Very close. Unrestricted overindulgence. Anybody characterize their own drinking as unrestricted overindulgence? Right? That's a spree. It says we usually come to from these sprees remorseful. So it says when he comes to from his spree, ask him one thing. Do you want to get over your drinking for good? Do you want to? That's all you need to know. Isn't that the directions that we got when we're working with a new person? What's the first thing we want to know? Do they want to quit for good? Do they honestly want to? Same thing they're asking. Do you want, because if they don't want to, it doesn't matter if they're alcoholic or not. If they're alcoholic, they're probably going to die that way. If they're not, then so be it. But there's nothing we can do if they don't want to get over it. We cannot convince them. We cannot convince them. The chances are he would. Show him your copy of this book and tell him what you found out about alcoholism. Again, sounds like, as a person that's tied by blood or affection to the alcoholic, ought to have found out something about alcoholism. They may have been studying this book, right? Show him that as alcoholics, the writers of the book understand. Writers, plural. Tell him some of the interesting stories you've read. Underline, if you think he will be shy of the spiritual remedy, ask him to look at the chapter on alcoholism. Then perhaps he will be interested enough to continue. He needs to be convinced that he's hopeless. That's what that's about. When you talk about the interesting stories, we talk about the case studies. You know, we've got 6, 7 different case studies in those first few chapters. If he is enthusiastic, your cooperation will mean a great deal. If he's lukewarm or thinks he's not alcoholic, we suggest you leave him alone. Another direction. Avoid urging him to follow our program. The seed has been planted in his mind. He knows that thousands of men, much like himself, have recovered, past tense, done deal. He knows that if you study this. But don't remind him of this after he has been drinking, for he may be angry. Sooner or later, you're likely to find him reading the book once more. Wait until repeated stumbling convinces him he must act. What's going to convince him he must act? Which is the same as being beat into. Exactly. For the more you hurry him, the longer his recovery may be delayed. So if you have it, we'll get this last paragraph in. If you have a number 3 husband, you may be in luck. So if he's gone down that far, you may be in luck now, right? Because you're certain he wants to stop, it says. That's why you may be in luck. That's the break. Being certain he wants to stop, you can go to him with this volume as joyful as though you had struck oil. I have a solution if you really want to quit. And it's right in here. He may not share your enthusiasm. That could be very well true. But he is practically sure to read the book, and he may go for the program at once. If he does not, you'll probably not have to wait long. Again, you should not crowd him. Let him decide for himself. Underline, cheerfully see him through more sprees. Have another one. Get up off that floor. Have another one. Let's get him to the bottom, right? Let's get him convinced. Talk about his condition, or this book only when he raises the issue. In some cases, it may be better to let someone outside the family present this book. They can urge action without arousing hostility. If your husband is otherwise a normal individual, your chances are good at this stage. I'm going to stop there. And you know what? I have a question about the things we've read in here with these directions, even all the way down to cheerfully seeing him through the next spree. And I'd like to know from an Al-Anon perspective. Actually, first I'm going to stop this recording.